Should be a refuah shalema for Elisha Menachem ben Ilana Shlomit. Right. We're on page Taf Lamed Beis, the Zera Shimshon and Parshas Vayigash, and this is a piece that I was looking for an opportunity to do throughout all this Parshios. There's a famous debate about. He's going to get into it, the discussion over what the underlying disagreement between the brothers was. And it was a very halachic argument about what their official status was. And throughout all these parshiyos, he makes a lot of different points and stories and elements all about this debate. I'll try to mention some of them, about what their status was in terms of were they Jews or not. And this is probably the place where he sums it up best. So we're going to look at it here, even though it's a little technical, but it is interesting the way he develops it. So Tani's Parakama, he quotes the Gemara in Masechtas Tanis, where Yosef says to them, Al tirgezu baderach. Don't become agitated on the road. Why was he concerned about that? So the Gemara says, Amar lahem Yosef la'achav. Yosef tells his brothers, Al tis'asku b'devar halacha. Don't get involved in halachic discussion on the road. Shelo tirgaz aleichem aderech, so that the road does not cause you to become agitated. And there must be 100 pshatim for this. What halacha would they be discussing? Why would a halachic discussion cause them to become agitated on the road? Simple reading is, don't endanger yourself while you're traveling, but it obviously means more than that. Makshim ma'olam, so the whole world asks, Lama husrach Yosef lomer lahem kach davka v'pam hazos. Why is Yosef telling them this at this point? Don't get into halachic discussions on the road so that you don't become agitated. V'chi lo hayu gam hem chachamim. Are they not sages too? Are they not wise enough to know that on the road you have to be careful? And if it's so dangerous to get involved in a halachic discussion on the road, why don't we find similar instructions from Yaakov? So just to explain simply, of course they knew that you're not supposed to get distracted on the road. You have to be careful and wary of danger, and all roads are dangerous. So especially since they did not know what happened to their brother Yosef, and that's why they were always very wary as they were traveling, because they saw that their family is not invincible. Look what happened to one of them, even though it was by their own doing, but one of them was sent into slavery or sold, and they don't know where he is. So you see that we, the sons of Yaakov, are not invincible. So therefore, it was obvious that whenever they traveled, they were always wary. But now they see that even when they send someone down into Egypt, into slavery, he ends up becoming the king, they might feel overconfident. And they won't be concerned about the judgment and the prosecutions. That's why Yosef tells them, don't get involved in discussion, because the roads are still dangerous. So that's a sort of just simple answer, is that he was worried that the brothers would feel like they're invincible, because even the brother they tried to hurt, nothing happened, so they would be less careful on the road. But using the realm of drush, using a more drushy, homiletic way of approaching it, this is the famous teaching from the Prashas Drachim, Rabbi Yehuda Razanis, the author of the Mishnah al-Melech. We know that Yosef was bringing the report that the brothers were eating limbs of a living animal. How could that be? Were the brothers really transgressing the most basic of prohibitions of the Noahide laws? Hainu, the answer is, because after an animal is slaughtered, after an animal is killed, it continues to move around and to tremor for a number of minutes. It could be sometimes 10, 15 minutes, and even an hour later, one of the legs of the animal could twitch. So, is the animal alive at that time, or is it dead? So the halacha is that for a Noachide, the definition of dead is when the animal stops moving. But for a Jew, as soon as you do the proper shlita, it's considered halachically dead, even if it's still moving. So they slaughtered the animal according to the halachic process of shlita, and they felt that as Jews, they were then permitted to cut up the animal and to eat it, even while there's still tremors. The Shvatim, they would cut limbs off the animal while it was still tremoring. Now, if you're a Jew, where the halachas of shchita apply, as soon as the animal is properly ritually slaughtered, hutra becomes permitted. But for a Noachide, it's still considered alive until it completely stops moving. So the brothers argued that they were no longer Noachides, and they had the laws of full Jews. Yosef was extra pious. He was, if we could say this, the brisker in the family. So he wanted to be machmer according to all the opinions. He says you're not allowed to be lenient and assume that you're no longer bnei Noach. Yosef wanted to take on the stringencies of both sides. The stringencies of being a Yisrael and the stringencies of being a Noachide. And therefore he felt that they should be more stringent and not cut up the animal until it's completely stopped moving. That's one point. Not to cut it up. You can't even cut it up until it stops moving. And if we were to take this debate between the brothers and Yosef, you can run it through all the parshios. Vayeshev, Miketz, Vayigash, and Vayechi, that all the arguments between Yosef and the brothers is regarding their status. Not only that, but even the wife of Potiphar gets involved in this debate, because when she's claiming that, if you're a Yisrael, then technically, once you're a Yisrael, you no longer need to recognize a marriage of a Noachide. It's not considered a marriage relative to you, and therefore you're permitted to me in a certain way. And he's saying, no, I have to be stringent in case I'm a Noachide as well. And so the whole story becomes this debate over the status of the Avos from a technical standpoint. The Ocha. Now, he's going to go to another place here. When the Jews were standing at the sea, there was an angel who was prosecuting against the Jews. He says, Halalu of the Avodah Zarah, these Egyptians worshipped idols, Halalu of the Avodah Zarah, but the Jews also worshipped idols. Uman ishtanu elu mi'elu, why should one be different than the other? HaKadosh Baruch Hu Heishiv, and Hashem answers, no. Klum avdua al mitoch ones mitoch shkaga. The Jewish people were either ones, meaning they were forced to do so, or they were shogeg, meaning they didn't know that it was prohibited. Okay. Have you ever heard of such an excuse of someone worshiping idols because they were forced to do so?
Sure.
Spanish Inquisition.
Right.
Is that permitted?
No. You're supposed to give your life up to them.
Oh. So what's Hashem responding to the angels? No, don't worry. The Jews are allowed to be saved at the sea, because they were either ones, it was against their will, or they were shogeg, they didn't know it was prohibited. So he says, let's think about this. What is the rationale of the prosecuting angel? We know the Jews were either forced or did so unknowingly. What's his complaint? The answer is very simple. If you worship idols, even if it's against your will, you still deserve the death penalty. Now, based in this world can't give you the death penalty, but in Shamayim, certainly a person deserves a death penalty because there are three cardinal sins. There's three things which you have to give your life for: idolatry, adultery, and murder. And for those things, you have no excuse. I was compelled to do so. I was forced to do so. You shouldn't have done it even if you were forced. You're supposed to give your life up rather than to do it. So, what's the response of Hashem that the Jews did it against their will? So he tells us a fascinating halacha. The halacha is like this. There's two mitigating factors. One is called ones, and one is called shogeg. Ones means it's against your will, you're forced, you're compelled to do so. And shogeg means you do so unknowingly. They are not the same. They're very different. Ones means I am choosing to do it, but only because I'm compelled to do so. Shogeg means I don't know that what I'm doing is prohibited, although I'm doing it of my own free will. Right? Ones means I know it's prohibited, but I don't want to do it. Shogeg means I do want to do it, I don't know it's prohibited. So a fascinating difference. By a Jew...
Isn't it, I don't want to do it, and I think it's not prohibited, shogeg?
Shogeg means I want to do the action, I just don't know it's prohibited. Because I'm choosing to do so.
I don't know that it is prohibited.
Right. I don't know that it's prohibited.
Okay.
So the halacha is like this. Shogeg is an exemption for a Jew. A Jew can say to God, I didn't know it was prohibited. And that's a good excuse. But for a Gentile, that's not a good excuse. If a Gentile says, I didn't know it was prohibited, we say to him, well, you should have known. But ones, being compelled to do so, is not an exemption for a Jew, because a Jew is required to give his life for these three things, but is an exemption for a Noachide. A Noachide is prohibited from committing idolatry, but he's not required to give his life for it, because he doesn't have the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem. Therefore, a Noachide has the exemption of being compelled. So he says, "Sheben Noach patur ba'ones." A Ben Noach does have the exemption of ones, of being compelled. Ve'ilu b'din shogegu lehapach. But when it comes to unknowing, unwilling, unintentional, Yisrael patur, that's an exemption for a Jew. Ben Noach chayev, while a Noachide is obligated. V'zu chumer sheyesh be'ben Noach. So each one has one leniency and one stringency. So the Mekatreg, the prosecuting angel, says, I am of the opinion, like Yosef, that Jews in Egypt were required to take both stringencies. They should not have allowed themselves to be to worship idols, even if they were compelled, and they had no excuse that it was unintentional, because Yosef argued that the Jews have to take the stringency of both sides. So now we're making the debate between Yosef and the brothers a debate between God and the angel. Kadosh Baruch Hu Heishiv Lo, and Hashem responds, Shikvar Yatsu Michlal B'nei Noach Lagamri. No, the Jews are not Noachites. V'dinam Ki Yisrael Gemurim and B'turim Ala Shogeg. Either they have the status of a Jew, in which case the fact that they were as unintentional exempts them. Or if you want to argue that they're still Noachides, in which case they would be exempt because they were compelled to do so. Either way, the Jews can be saved. We're not going to take both stringencies, because the Gemara tells us, you're not allowed to take all the stringencies. The halacha is that if you are a rabbi, you have a rabbi, you have to follow that rabbi with all of his leniencies and all of his stringencies. You can't say, well, that rabbi who's in that shul allows me to do this, so I go with that. And when it comes to the other rule, I call this other rabbi because he allows that. Whoever your halachic rabbi is, he has a path, he has an approach within the halachic process, and so when you follow him, you follow that halachic process, you're valid. It could be that the next person over would do the same thing, that they would be breaking Shabbos. But because my rabbi, following the approach and the teachings that he has, permits this, so then I am okay. I'm not breaking Shabbos. Let's take an example. Let's say, what's an example of Shabbos that's not controversial? It's hard to think of an example. But let's say making tea in a klisheni. Let's go with that. Making tea on Shabbos. There are certainly opinions that would say that you cannot make tea, even in the klisheni. You can't take tea from the urn and put it into a cup and put a tea bag into it. There are some opinions that would prohibit that. Rather, they would say that you have to, before Shabbos, prepare the tea sense. Now, there's different opinions. So now, if your rabbi prohibits this, but you don't want to follow his ruling there, and instead you call up some other rabbi and says, how do I make tea so that you can get the heter? You're now breaking Shabbos. Because since this is your rabbi and his halachic process follows this path, if you deviate from that path, you're breaking Shabbos. You have to stick with whatever your rabbi's approach is, both for the leniency and the stringency. Otherwise, you are being overly lenient. However, he's saying the other direction. You're not allowed to take all the stringencies either. You're not doing anything wrong, because by being stringent, you're technically not transgressing. But he says, "Aksil b'choshech holech." It's only the fool that walks in darkness. You're being foolish, because what's permitted is permitted, what's prohibited is prohibited. So says Hashem to the angel, seemingly, Yosef was wrong to take the stringencies of both sides. Either you consider yourself a ben Noachides, or you consider yourself Jews, in which case, either way, the Jews would be exempt in Egypt, because either they were compelled to do so, or it was unintentional. To take both stringencies is not okay. So, the problem is, so how do we explain Yosef? How does Yosef take? So v'kasha shediver anav l'choras asiyadadi. There seems to be a problem here. Shehoyel sheyosef ayatofes chumras shneim. Yosef took the stringencies of both. Yesh aliyas nikra chassid b'zeh. According to this, we can't look at Yosef as the great tzaddik. Sheirei adarabi midas aksilim. Yosef is acting the fool. Al kachach tzarach lomer dahachashani d'sveike d'dina huray lahachmer. So he says, however, there is a time when you're allowed to be stringent. You're allowed to be stringent if the rule is if the situation is unresolved. If there's a question about what the halachic ruling is, then you're allowed to be stringent on both sides. So Yosef held that this is not a question of pick one side. This is an unresolved question, and therefore he felt you could be stringent both ways. Yaakov at least had this in question, and he explained this elsewhere. Let's go to the next paragraph. With this we can explain who gave the brothers the right to sell Yosef into slavery. The answer is because Yosef had no right to take the stringencies of both sides, and he's considered a fool. Also, Yosef is denying his Judaism. Yosef, because he's taking Noachite stringencies. So the brothers said, Abraham converted, and Yitzchak took it further, and our father Yaakov, and you're saying, well, I'm not sure we're really Jewish. So Yosef, in a sense, is denying his Judaism. It's a big deal, because up until now, we look at Yosef was making claims about them, he was insulting them. According to this interpretation of the story, that this is the debate about what their status is, they felt that Yosef was undermining everything that the patriarchs had established in terms of establishing the Jewish people. Now we understand the Medrash. It says, Nasu mizeh, your brothers have traveled from here. Hisiu atzma min ha'achva, they've removed themselves from being your brother. How do you remove yourself from being a brother? You can't undo your brother in this? They were saying to Yosef, you're claiming that we are not Jewish, and therefore there's no brotherhood. Okay, let's move on to the next paragraph and get it complicated. Rav Sa'oram Achva de Rava have a takiv inshid lo mali umayla beguharka de Rava. The Gemara tells us that the Rav Sa'oram, the brother of Rava, now Rava was the big rabbi, he was the Rosh Hashiva, and he had a brother who was a police officer. And so his brother, whenever someone would do something wrong, would arrest the person and put them into work service, community service. So he would make them work for his brother Rava, who was the Rosh Hashiva. So this is an interesting situation, but the police officer would arrest people and say you have to do community service, and he would call up his brother, the Rosh Hashiva, and say if you got any work for them to do for the community. The Tanya, because it says, because if you see someone who's not doing the right thing, you're allowed to put them into enslavement. But only if he's doing something wrong, deserving of this kind of punishment. So one of the things available for the courts is to put someone into a state of enslavement. If Yosef is denying his Judaism, plus he's committing these treacherous acts, therefore they were allowed to sell him into slavery. So the brothers felt pretty confident about what they did, until Yosef reveals himself to them. Now they see God planned all this for the good. What they had planned for evil. They had not sold him into slavery. They'd sold him into sovereignty. So now the brothers have to question whether they were right originally. Doesn't this mean that God agrees with Yosef that maybe we're not full Jews? And that's the debate that the brothers would have on the road. And that would cause them problems, because now they have to rework their whole outlook on life. Their whole halachic position of them being complete Jews and all of its implications is now in question, and now they have to readdress and reconfigure, they have to recalculate their whole approach to life, and that's going to cause them to become agitated on the road.
So, Rabbi, you're saying the reason they sold him because that was his punishment, right? They almost killed him, right?
Right. So it would mean that the brothers who killed him somehow felt that he was so much undermining their existence, according to this, by denying their Judaism, that he was someone worthy of the death penalty, like an idol worshiper or something. And then Yehuda would say, no, let's not do that, let's just sell him. But why sell him? Sell him because that's an appropriate punishment for someone who is denying their Judaism.
So I don't understand, why do we say that we first became Jews at Har Sinai when we got the Torah?
That's the debate here. The brothers argue that we are already Jews, and Yosef argues not until Har Sinai. And so we're going to go on, because that's exactly what's going to continue in this debate.
But why doesn't Yosef just take if he's saying you don't become Jews until Har Sinai, then why doesn't he just stay like the laws of Bnei Noach and not do both?
Because he's also a little bit unsure, and he's taking the stringencies of both sides, and that's why he's saying that technically he should be considered a fool. We'll see soon why not, but technically he should be considered a fool because he's taking both the stringencies of both sides.
So maybe a silly question, but why didn't they ask Yaakov if they had shaylas about this?
Well, so he's saying, he talks about this earlier in Parshas Vayishlach, that Yaakov seems to be taking both sides as well. So such as the marrying of two sisters, which was permitted for Noachide, and then yet at other times, you see, so they felt that Yaakov was going to give them, and once you ask the question...
So why not ask Shem and Aver?
Well, Shem and Aver are for sure Noachides.
No, but they could have an opinion.
Shem and Aver are not alive anymore. thing, counting correctly.
Really?
Yeah.
Aver's not alive?
Aver, you have to check what time, what year Aver passes away, but definitely, there. I mean, Shem is gone before before this. Yeah. Okay. Mishim hachi hutzrach lomalem. That's why he says to them, "Al tirgazu b'derech." Don't become agitated on the road. Al tasku b'dvar halacha. Don't get involved in halacha. Shel tirgaz aleichem aderech. The next page. Lefisha efshar l'neis shal kriyas yamsu. So ready for this? Yosef says to them, at the splitting of the sea, you're going to need either the excuse that the Jews were compelled to worship idols, looking at themselves as Noachites, or they're going to need the argument that the Jews did it unintentionally, and only then will the sea split. So Yosef says to them, I know that in order for the sea to split, I need to be wrong. So don't switch your positions.
Don't debate it.
Don't come to my side, because we need that the majority of the brothers should disagree with me to allow the splitting of the sea. The Medrash is a very difficult Medrash. It says, why did the brothers hate him? It's because it says that the brothers saw the coat, which was striped, a striped coat, so therefore the brothers hated him. Says the Medrash, no. They didn't hate him because of the striped coat. They hated him so that the sea would split into stripes. And all the commentaries say, what? What does the sea splitting into stripes have to do with the brothers hating him? He says, no, that's what it means. The brothers disagreed with him. They had to disagree with him, because if they don't disagree with him, then the Jews have to take the stringencies of both sides, and the Jews have no excuse for worshiping idols in Egypt.
The sea won't split.
And the sea won't split. So because the brothers disagree with Yosef, and they halachically rule in this world that the Jews are not the stringency of both sides, God has to follow the ruling of the majority and split the sea for the Jews.
Isn't there an opinion that the sea split when it saw Yosef?
Oh, we'll get to that. That's exactly it. Okay. And Yosef does not want them to recant. So he says like this: Yaakov wants to dwell in serenity. So at that point, Yosef says, "Oh, we're not going to have any exile. If we're not going to have any exile, because Father Yaakov wants to dwell in peace and wants to bring Mashiach and wants to bring the world to..." So then, Yosef maybe dibasam la'aviv. That's why he was bringing a bad report to his father. They were eating of the limbs of the animals while they were still tremoring, because he was closest to their father. And he saw how much their father was trying to avoid exile and bring world peace. And therefore, he said, we have to take the stringencies. But now he realizes his mistake. He sees he was sold into slavery. There will be an Egyptian exile. And if there will be an Egyptian exile, now we're going to need the splitting of the sea. They had to keep their opinion. The Isa B'Zera Berach, the Sefer Zera Berach says, Kama Tamim al Galus Mitzrayim. There's many reasons why the Jews were in Egypt. And maybe Sham B'Shem Azor Chadash, and one of the reasons is Shahol Shashvatim Gomer LeYaakov Lias Betzar Shel Yosef Chav Beis Shanim, because they caused their father distress for 22 years. Shemachin Ischai V'Lias Begalus Reish Chav Shanim, they had to be in exile for 220 years, 10 times that amount. And we're assuming it's 10 brothers causing their father agitation for 22 years equals 220. How many years were they in Egypt? 210. 10 years were taken off by the suffering of the 10 brothers of dying outside of Eretz Yisrael, rather than being in Eretz Yisrael. And that takes it down from 220 to 210. Anyway, back to the subject. And this is just an incredible way of thinking of the Zera Shimshon. What does Yosef say to them? Al tirgazu b'derach. Don't become agitated on the road. What was the language of the Gemara that he said before? Al tis'asku b'dvar halacha. Don't get involved in words of halacha. Shelo tirgaz aleichem haderach. That the road should not become agitated for you. That's a strange way of saying it. Don't get involved in halacha. Al tirgezu b'derech means you guys don't become agitated on the road. And the Gemara changes it. No. You don't get involved in halacha so that the road does not become agitated against you. How do roads become agitated against people? So he says, Amalem shematir gazalechem aderech. You know the road that's going to become agitated against you? Shematir gazalechem amekatrik b'yamsuf, the sea that you're traveling through. The dangers of the road is not the road now that you're going back to your father. It's the road which in 211 years or 210 years you'll be traveling out of Egypt. Don't get involved in this halacha. And go to the bottom line. That's why the word is rogez. What's the literal translation of rogez? Not agitation. Anger. Right? Because the attribute of judgment will be prosecuting against you. And furthermore, he says, the word is haderech, the road. The road means some famous road. So to the next paragraph, the famous medrash that you quoted before, it says, Hayam ra'av ayanos. The sea saw and it split. And it fled, literally. What did it see? Arona shal Yosef ra. It saw the coffin of Yosef coming. Why does it use the language, the coffin of Yosef? Why doesn't it say it saw Yosef coming? Isn't that a derogatory way of saying that it saw Yosef? For example, the most common explanation of this medrash is that the halacha is that Yosef went down to Egypt first. Why did he go down to Egypt before his brothers? So we talked about this a few weeks ago, because Egypt is the most vile, immoral place in all the world. It's called Ervas Haaretz, the erva, the nakedness of the land, the abomination of the land. It is the place with the lowest level of moral standards. Jews do not survive well in a place with low moral standards. We are very sensitive to these things, and it affects us in a very serious way. And the only way, and so it's strange, here we are in the United States, and we are suffering with, what are we up to, 75% assimilation? Because we, in a place where there are no moral standards, none of these rules, we very easily fall into that freedom for all, everyone can do whatever they want kind of thinking, and we get lost in it. Why is it that in Egypt we only have one casualty in 210 years, and even that one casualty, the Torah makes such a big deal about it, and he ends up becoming the blasphemer and being killed, because this is the only one example, and even in her case, it might not have been her fault. How is it that happens? So the holy books tell us that it's because Yosef went down to Egypt first. Yosef is the tzaddik, and he faced the challenge, the greatest level of challenge that anyone has ever overcome. A 17-year-old boy with no family, no friends, no protection, denying the advances of the wife of Potiphar, who they say was exceptionally beautiful, and she was relentless in the process of her attempts to seduce Yosef. Relentless. Day after day after day. And it came to the point where he had already broken. As it says, Vayavu Abayis Elasus Malachto, he came. He came to do it. And still, he overcame this test and brought himself to a place of Kedusha and fled. That was such a powerful act that it ingrained into the mind of the Jew that for the next 210 years, the challenge became easier. It could be why. That's why, because we had no Yosef Atzadik who preceded us to the Americas. Maybe that's why we still suffer from that kind of assimilation. So that fleeing of Yosef, which kept the Kedusha of the Jewish people, so they say that's why the sea saw the coffin of Yosef, and it says, Vayamnas Yosef achutza, Yosef ran outside, and Hayamra Vayanos, it's the same verb, because it saw that the Jewish people maintained the Kedusha through Yosef. But according to this medrash, according to this explanation, it's difficult. Why use the example of Arona Shel Yosef, the coffin of Yosef?
I was just going to say, though, that to say it was because Yosef was there, I always thought that it was because of the enslavement. When you're a slave, it's not like you have a choice to start assimilating with the regular, masters that you have. So, I mean...
Well, they weren't slaves for much of the time. According to some, the actual, difficult labor was only about 80-something years. So you had this space in between where there was plenty of opportunity for assimilation. And even there, so it happens, even with slaves and masters. Thomas Jefferson, right? It's the way that the way the world works. But somehow nothing, no such examples. One maybe. So the problem is, according to this explanation, why use the term the coffin of Yosef? It saw the body of Yosef or the holiness of Yosef. So he says that the problem was, as long as Yosef was right, the sea is not going to split. I'm just going to say this outside because we're going to run short on time. But we have a famous Gemara he quotes in the next paragraph. The Gemara says, why is Yosef the first of the brothers to die? It's a very easy calculation to make, but it seems even from the Torah itself that Yosef is the first one to die of all his brothers. And the answer is, Mipnei shehinig atzmo berabanus, because he took the leadership, the mantle of leadership. And leadership kills. It not only does it make you age faster, but somehow leadership, if it's very difficult to maintain perfect spiritual credit up in heaven, being in charge. So he says, now if his brothers sinned by selling him, then we can't hold it against Yosef for taking leadership over them. He says, since we do consider Yosef to be wrong for being an authority over his brothers, it must be that the brothers did have a right to sell him. So if the brothers did have a right to sell him, why does he become a king? He says maybe he becomes the king because he survives the test of the wife of Potiphar. So what we're saying is like this. The brothers arrive in Egypt, and they see that Yosef has become the king. They say, this means we must have been wrong. We must have, and now we're going to recalculate. Says Yosef to them, if you recalculate, you agree with me, the sea won't split. Instead, you should know that there's a different reason why I'm the king. The reason why I'm the king is because I survived the test with the wife of Potiphar, and Kedusha and Malchus go together. So the sea splits when it sees the coffin of Yosef. Says the Zera Shimshon, I don't know where he gets this from. He says that the coffins of the brothers, because we know it wasn't just the coffin of Yosef that was taken, but the coffin of all the brothers. He says that they were taken out in the order of their death. So Yosef was led first, and Levi, I believe is the one who lived the longest, or died the last, would have been the last of the coffins. So he didn't see Yosef coming. He saw the coffin of Yosef. He saw that Yosef's coffin was first. Why was Yosef's coffin first? Because Yosef died first, because he really shouldn't have taken authority and leadership over his brothers. Which means that the brothers were on a certain level correct for selling him. If the brothers were correct for selling him, that means that they did have the right to claim to have the status of Jews. And if they did have the right to claim the status of Jews, then the sea is supposed to split. So let's go to the next page, Taf Lamed Hey. He says, so he says, with this you'll understand, could it be that Parshas Vayeshev, Yosef is 17. Yaakov and his sons are already living in Eretz Yisrael for more than a decade. Why is it that after a decade, this fighting between the brothers starts? See, he wants to suggest that as long as Yosef, they all knew there was going to be an exile, and as long as there was going to be an exile, we needed the status of either being a Jew or a Noachite, but not the stringencies of both. It's only once the father, Yaakov, wants to Leshev B'Shalva, and who's sitting with Yaakov this whole time while the brothers are out shepherding? Yosef is sitting with his father, Yosef, before he gets sent away, and his father is telling him, we're not going to have an exile. Bikich Yaakov Leishiv B'Shalva. We're going to dwell in Eretz Yisrael forever. We're going to arrange this so that we can be here all the time, which means we won't need to see the sea split. There's no need for this redemption. And at that point, if there's no need for redemption, the brothers should have been more stringent both ways. And that's the way Yaakov would have wanted him. So it turns out that Yosef is making this assumption, but he's wrong, because Hashem disagreed with. And what happens? Bikish Yaakov leishev b'shalva. What's the next line? Kafza alav rogzo shel Yosef. The same word rogez. The same anger comes, and now what happens is, it turns out that Yaakov's own plan, the son that he is teaching this to, the son that he's telling him, don't worry, you don't need to keep, you can keep the stringency of both sides. We don't need this leniency. No one's ever going to worship idols. That's the son that gets sent down to Egypt. That's the irony of how it works. Through the Yaakov wanting to dwell in serenity, it's that same son that he was going to create the serenity through who gets sold. And Yosef says to the brothers, now that we are, instead of you agreeing with me, I have to agree with you, because we are going to need the sea to split. However, and I want to reiterate this and we'll finish with this, however, we still have to resolve the question for why does Yosef become king? And that's what Zera Shimshon says. He becomes king not because he was right, not because he had the right to leadership over his brothers, but because when you maintain that level of sanctity and purity, you earn sovereignty. But it still counts against you when you take authority over someone else to cost him 10 years, enough that his coffin being first becomes the sign of that. With that we'll end. He goes on more, and you can see how you can read all of these parshas in this method. I think it's important to know, sometimes we're more esoteric here, and sometimes we're in this world of Drush. It's important to realize how many layers there are in the Torah, and the Zera Shimshon gives us insights into all of them. But we have to understand, in terms of the halachic process, the lesson that we can take from this is to realize halachas are very complex. There is a path and approach to halacha. And in this case, this debate, this halachic debate, is going to affect and have changes on the world at large. And I'll just finish with one quick story. There's a story told about the Divrei Yoel. Divrei Yoel was a gadol in drush. He used to give drushes like this. He would go on for hours. He'd probably spend all of Sefer Bereshis, and from the beginning to the end, making it all one debate. He was just brilliant. And one time, someone came to him for a refuah shalema. Someone was not feeling well. So he started to give a drasha. He said, everything will be okay, and he started to give a drasha. When he gave a drasha, there were very few people who were allowed to ask questions. But there were some people who were on the level where they already knew the next 10 things he's going to say, so that they could ask questions. So one of these people, whose job was to ask questions, that would make it more lively, raised his hand, and he said, no, not now. They found it kind of strange, because he's always allowed to ask questions. That's part of the shir. So he kept going for another 10 minutes, and then the other person raised his hand again. He said, no, not now. And after the third time it happened, they all realized that he's giving his shir in a way where the halachic implications of the shir should lead to a certain direction, which would, if you follow the chain far enough, lead to a refuah shalema to that person who's sick. Because halachically, based on the implications of this, technically that is considered a kosher animal. That's not a kosher animal. Get into a whole thing. So sometimes the way that we study Torah and the implications of that can have an effect, not just on the Torah we're learning, but in the world around us. So all those who need a refuah shalema should receive a refuah shalema of B'sech Shachar Yisrael.
Amen.